The fluorescent lights hummed their endless complaint overhead as Katie Rodriguez pushed a med cart down the third-floor corridor of Seattle General, moving through the hospital like someone who'd learned to make herself invisible. Her scrubs were regulation blue, her badge clipped low, her posture a masterclass in taking up less space than she actually occupied. Nobody noticed her. This was intentional. The antiseptic smell that most people described in clinical terms hit differently when you'd breathed it mixed with diesel exhaust and desert dust. She pushed the thought away. 2 years since Sangin. 2 years of Seattle General's clean hallways, its orderly hierarchy, its predictable rhythms. 2 years of being nobody in particular, which was exactly what she needed to be. Her hands moved through the routine with practiced efficiency, checking fours, noting vitals on the electronic charts with the kind of precision that made her stand out to anyone actually paying attention. But people rarely did. The resident swept past without making eye contact. The attending physicians nodded when necessary and forgot her face immediately after. This was fine. Fine was safe. It was 6:11 a.m. when Dr. Ashford found her restocking the supply station near the ICU. She recognized him immediately, though they'd never spoken before. Ashford moved through Seattle General the way powerful people moved through any institution, as if the architecture itself had been arranged for his convenience. He was tall, expensive-looking in the way that came from a century of family money wearing the same tailored coat, and he carried the particular confidence of a man whose authority had never been seriously questioned. His white coat had Chief of Surgery embroidered in gold thread that caught the fluorescent light like a warning. Rodriguez. He made it sound like a question, though he was clearly reading her name badge. ICU, right? Yes, sir. One measured breath. Keep the voice even. Deferential. Small. I'm reassigning you to the John Doe case. Trauma Bay 7. He's been unconscious for 16 hours, no identification, no family contact. I need someone who can handle the baseline monitoring without getting in the way of my team. He paused, and she could feel the weight of his inspection, the kind of clinical assessment that doctors reserved for people they'd already decided weren't particularly important. You can follow orders. Of course, doctor. Good. He's yours. Ashford was already turning away, already dismissing her from his attention. Let me know if his vitals change significantly. Katie nodded, waited until his footsteps echoed far enough down the corridor, then made her way to Trauma Bay 7. The John Doe was a man in his 60s, grey-bearded, with the kind of lean muscularity that didn't disappear with age, the kind that came from a lifetime of training your body to respond instantly. His chart was thin. No allergies listed. No medical history. No emergency contact. Just a man with no apparent past, unconscious and alone. She was adjusting the drip when she saw it. His belongings had been placed in a clear plastic bag, standard protocol. And in that bag, catching the light from above, was a medal on a faded ribbon. She didn't recognize the specific decoration from where she stood, but something about the curve of it, the weight it seemed to carry even through plastic, made her pause. She set down the stand and moved closer, her heartbeat acquiring a rhythm that wasn't quite normal. The medal was gold. The ribbon was black and gold, which meant Ranger. Which meant no. She looked at his face again, really looked this time. The scar tissue along his left temple. The way his hands were positioned, even unconscious, they were ready, palms slightly open, muscles coiled. The tattoo on his wrist that she could barely see in the hospital lighting but that she recognized anyway because she had the same one, just in a different location. The name on the chart was still John Doe, but Katie knew exactly who was lying in this bed. Colonel Marcus Vance. The officer who'd sat across from her at the tribunal in a military courtroom at Fort Benning 18 months ago. The man who'd called her reckless. Who'd called her unfit for command. Who'd recommended a medical discharge after she'd disobeyed his direct orders to save 43 civilians, because following orders would have meant leaving them to die. Her hands steadied themselves through sheer force of will. She checked the again, confirmed the oxygen saturation was adequate, documented her findings in the computer with fingers that moved without trembling. This was what training gave you, the ability to function even when the ground was collapsing underneath you. She found Dr. Ashford in the ICU central station and requested a patient transfer. Her voice was quiet. Professional. I believe there may be a conflict of interest with this assignment, Doctor. Ashford looked up from his computer, and something flickered across his face, annoyance, primarily, but underneath it something sharper. A conflict? Yes, sir. I would be more effective on a different case. Rodriguez. He said it slowly, as if testing the sound of the word. The attending physicians at the nearest station were already glancing up, already registering that something unusual was happening. Let me explain something to you about this hospital. About medicine, more broadly. Personal feelings don't get to dictate which patients we treat. Professional responsibility supersedes preference. I understand, Doctor. I'm simply suggesting. You're a nurse, not a physician. You don't get to suggest case assignments. He stood, and his voice leveled out in a way that carried across the entire unit. She could see families in patient rooms noticing the shift in tone. Could see the Vance family, a woman in her 60s, a younger man who had the colonel's bone structure, turning toward the sound. Some nurses seem to think they're too good for difficult patients. Maybe you're one of them, Miss Rodriguez. Maybe you need remedial training in professional duty. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilators working. He sat back down, already moving on to the next task, already dismissing her again. But the Vance family was still looking. The woman had a hand pressed to her chest, and there was something in her expression, a complex mixture of gratitude, as if Ashford's assertion of dominance had somehow restored some small measure of control in a situation where they had none. Katie returned to her station without responding. 30 minutes later, she found her name on the unit board. Under corrective action, insubordination, refusing patient assignment. The words glowed like a scarlet letter, public enough that anyone passing through the ICU would see it. She stared at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked to the break room, where she took a seat at one of the tables. Staff members at the other 3 tables registered her arrival and, one by one, gathered their coffee cups and their charts and found reasons to be somewhere else. Within 90 seconds, she was alone in a room that smelled like reheated food and disappointment. That's when she let herself feel it. One tear, sliding down her cheek. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Dr. Ashford, who was visible through the break room window, watching her from the central station. Watching to see if she would break. She didn't break. Instead, she stood, crossed back to the central station, and looked Ashford directly in the eyes. When she spoke, her voice was steady as surgical steel. Colonel Vance will receive the best care this hospital can provide, Doctor. You have my word. She moved back to Trauma Bay 7 and pulled on a fresh pair of gloves. The examination was methodical, clinical, the way she'd been trained. She checked his pupils, his reflexes, the responsiveness that wasn't there. She noted everything in the chart with a kind of precision that left no room for interpretation. And then she checked his belongings. The Ranger Scroll medal was there, exactly as she'd seen it through the plastic. But as she carefully examined the rest of his jacket, navy blue, Marine Corps issue, probably 15 years old, she felt something else sewn into the lining. She didn't remove it. Didn't need to. She already knew what it was. A unit patch. Sangin Valley, Helm and Province. The 75th Ranger Regiment. The same unit. The same deployment that had ended with her husband in a flag-draped box and her conscience in pieces. The same patch she had hidden in a lockbox at home, wrapped in brown paper, unable to display it and unable to throw it away. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent to the collision of 2 pasts, 2 trajectories, colliding in a hospital bed on the 3rd floor of a place that suddenly felt very small. The cardiac monitor screamed its flatline song at 2:53 a.m. Vance's chest stopped moving. The ventilator kept pushing air into dead lungs. Dr. Ashford stood frozen at the bedside, his hand still holding the central line needle he'd been attempting to place for the past 40 seconds. 40 seconds too long. The OR nurse, Patterson, 5 years on the unit, glanced at the clock on the wall. 3 minutes until the scheduled surgeon arrived from home. 3 minutes Vance did not have. Katie was charting at the station when the code alert flashed across the monitor. She didn't hesitate. She moved toward the ICU room on instinct, her body already knowing what her mind was trying to compartmentalize. Ashford was still standing there when she entered, his expensive watch catching the overhead light, his posture suggesting he was waiting for someone else to take charge. The kind of man who delegated his disasters. "Let me through," Katie said. "I have this handled," Ashford replied, his voice carrying that particular arrogance of someone who'd never been told no by a nurse beneath his pay grade. Katie didn't repeat herself. She moved past him with the fluid precision of someone who'd operated in worse chaos than a Houston hospital ICU. She assessed in seconds. Asystole. No pulse. No respiration. Ashford's central line attempt had failed, and now Vance was bleeding slowly into his own chest cavity. The monitor showed nothing. Flat. Silent. Dead. She looked at Patterson. "Get me a size 7 endotracheal tube, 1 milligram epi drawn up, and a left anterolateral thoracotomy tray. Now." Patterson moved. So did the other nurses. The room reorganized itself around Katie's voice like iron filings around a magnet. Ashford retreated to the corner, his face darkening with something that looked like rage mixed with the first cold spike of fear. Katie's hands were already moving. She prepped Vance's left side with iodine, her movements precise as a metronome. 45 seconds. 60. The knife went in with one smooth motion, the same motion she'd performed on a Marine with a sucking chest wound outside Sangin in 115-degree heat, except here it was climate-controlled and fluorescent-lit and staffed with people who were watching her as if she'd suddenly transformed into something they didn't have a name for. The incision opened the ribcage. She could feel Vance's heart beneath her fingers, a muscle, nothing more. Pain is information. Blood and anatomy. She began manual compressions, her other hand reaching into the chest cavity, fingers closing around the heart muscle itself. Compressing. Releasing. Compressing. "Push epi," she said. The medication went in. The monitor registered nothing. 30 seconds. 60. 90. Her hands worked with the kind of muscle memory that only came from having done something 1,000 times before, in places where hesitation meant watching people die. "Sinus rhythm," Patterson said. Her voice trembled. The heart responded. 1 beat. 2. The monitor picked up the rhythm like a prayer being answered. Katie maintained compressions for another 30 seconds, then withdrew her hand. Blood dripped from her glove onto the tile. The ventilator resumed its mechanical breathing, and for the first time since the alarm started, Vance's chest rose and fell on someone else's lungs instead of the machinery forcing it. Katie straightened. Her scrubs were soaked. There was blood on her neck where a droplet had splattered. She didn't look at Ashford. She was already walking toward the sink, already pulling off her gloves with movements that suggested nothing unusual had occurred, that she hadn't just performed a procedure that required 6 weeks of specialized training and years of actual field experience. The room stayed silent. Patterson stared at her. 2 residents who'd been standing by exchanged a look. The med student, someone named Chen, maybe, actually stepped backward, as if proximity to Katie had become dangerous. Ashford left the room without speaking. His footsteps clicked down the hallway with the sharp aggression of a man whose carefully constructed world had just shifted on its axis. Katie finished washing her hands. The blood spiraled down the drain in pink swirls. She could see her reflection in the mirror above the sink, hair escaping from a ponytail, face expressionless, eyes the color of worn denim. Just a nurse. That's what she'd told herself for the past 2 years. Just a nurse. Just someone who took orders and followed protocols and made herself smaller every single day. But Ashford had seen something different. And now he knew. The next morning, Katie found the first written notice slipped into her personnel file. Advanced medical intervention beyond scope of practice. Unauthorized use of surgical techniques. Potential liability. Ashford's signature was centered at the bottom in expensive blue ink. She held the paper for exactly 3 seconds, then slid it back into the folder. The accusation was technically correct. She had performed a thoracotomy. She was not credentialed to perform a thoracotomy. And she had saved a man's life doing it. By day 3, Ashford had made his calls. She saw the schedule change on the unit board. Her name shifted to nights. Exclusively nights. 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., paired with skeleton crews and rotating float nurses who didn't know the unit well enough to notice when protocols got bent. Isolated. The word floated through her mind like something bitter. By day 5, she overheard security asking Patterson about gaps in Katie's employment history. She has DD 214 on file, Patterson said. Katie's stomach went cold. A DD 214 was the document they gave you when you left the military. It was the paper trail that proved you'd been someone before you were whoever you were pretending to be now. She sat in her car during the next break, hands gripping the steering wheel at exactly 10 and 2, and let herself feel the weight of it. Her discharge. Her medical separation from the 75th Ranger Regiment. The folder marked PTSD, service-connected, honorable discharge. All of it neatly documented in a personnel file that Ashford had apparently decided to excavate like a grave. The fluorescent hospital lights glowed in her rearview mirror. 2 more hours until her shift ended. 2 more hours of being the woman everyone was learning to whisper about. The nurse who did things. The nurse who knew things. The nurse who'd been hiding something from the moment she'd taken the Seattle General ID badge. And that wasn't even the worst part. Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway of the ICU at 3:14 p.m. on a Wednesday with his suspension letter already printed, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from knowing nobody in the hospital would challenge him. Katie was adjusting Vance's ventilator settings when she heard the footsteps. Ashford's always arrived like a closing argument, deliberate and final. He didn't ask her to step away from the patient. He announced it loud enough for the entire unit to hear. Your suspension is effective immediately, Major Rodriguez. He said her rank like a slur. Pending investigation into your pattern of boundary violations and demonstrated mental instability. You'll surrender your badge, your access codes, and any hospital property in your possession. She didn't look at him. She finished adjusting the flow rate. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and indifferent to the man deciding her employment status. When she finally turned, her eyes held his for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to see that his words had landed on nothing. No trembling. No protest. Just a measured breath, the kind she'd learned in a desert where emotion was the thing that got people killed. I understand, Doctor. That was all. One calm sentence. But the entire ICU felt the weight of it, the way a room changes when someone stops defending themselves and starts accepting consequences. Ashford expected anger or tears or desperation, something he could use. Instead, he got silence so complete that the heart monitor became the loudest thing in the room. He turned and left, his white coat trailing behind him like he was still in control, but something in his jaw suggested he wasn't entirely certain anymore. By 6:51 p.m., Katie stood in the rain at Ridgewood Cemetery on the edge of Houston, her scrubs soaked through, her shoes sinking into the wet grass. The headstone read exactly as she'd memorized it 17 years ago, Captain James Rodriguez, KIA Sangin, Afghanistan. The dates underneath, 1989 to 2011, had never changed, which was the point of headstones. They marked the moment everything stopped for someone else while the living kept moving forward. She pressed her hand against the granite. It was cold. Everything was cold. I tried to start over like you wanted. Her voice cracked on the first word but steadied by the second, the way trained voices do when they're used to speaking over the sound of rotors and mortar fire. I put on scrubs instead of body armor. I saved lives instead of taking them. I made myself into someone who belonged in a hospital instead of a war zone. The rain hammered harder, running down her face, indistinguishable from tears now. But I failed, James. I can't escape what I am. I tried to be someone else and it wasn't enough. He saw right through me. One moment, 1 second where my hands remembered something they were trained to do, and now everything's falling apart again. She stood there for another 8 minutes, her uniform growing heavier with water and the weight of 23 years of military service that she'd tried to compress into civilian silence. By the time she left the cemetery, her fingertips were numb and her breath came in visible clouds in the cooling evening air. Thursday morning arrived with a phone call from Human Resources at 8:22 a.m. Katie was in her apartment, a studio in a part of Houston where people didn't ask questions about gap years or DD-214 discharge papers, when the investigator explained that the suspension hearing was scheduled for Monday. The hearing that would decide whether she kept her nursing license or whether the hospital's claims about mental instability would follow her to the next hospital and the next one after that. "Your background check is complete," the investigator said. His name was Torres. He sounded tired. "We're flagging something in your file that I'll need to discuss with you." She waited. Silence was a tool. She knew how to use silence. "Your federal security clearance," Torres continued. "It's marked as active. Which is unusual. For a hospital nurse, that's unusual. There's a classified notation attached. I'm reading a Pentagon access code right now that shouldn't exist in our system." "Katie, what am I looking at here?" Her hand went cold. Not from fear, from the recognition that the compartments she'd built so carefully between the life she'd lived and the life she'd chosen were finally, inevitably, collapsing into each other. On the other end of the line, she heard Torres rifling through documents, could almost see the moment his eyes landed on sections that carried government seals. "I'm going to need you to come in for the full hearing Monday morning," Torres said quietly. "We may need to adjust how we approach this. I'm reading things that don't match the personnel file you submitted." He hung up before she could respond. She sat in the dark of her apartment, one hand still pressed to the phone, and watched the rain start again through her window. The weather was turning, Houston's August heat breaking into something cooler, something that felt almost like a storm clearing. Monday arrived like a verdict. The hearing room at Seattle General was on the 3rd floor, administrative offices where fluorescent lights cast everything in the same sickly yellow, where the carpet muffled footsteps and the silence felt intentional. Katie arrived at 8:51 a.m. in civilian clothes, jeans, a dark sweater, her hospital badge removed and surrendered. Torres was already there, and he looked different now, the way people do when they've been reading documents above their clearance level and understand they've stepped into something larger than hospital bureaucracy. He had her file open. Not the employment file. The other one. The doors opened from the hallway, and Vance's daughter appeared. She was in her early 40s, with her father's sharp features and the same quiet intensity that Katie recognized from the ICU, the bearing of someone who'd grown up around military discipline. Behind her, Katie could see Vance himself in the waiting area, awake, sitting upright, his eyes moving with the kind of focus that suggested the man who'd court-martialed her had come back from the edge. "My father woke up yesterday morning." Vance's daughter spoke to Torres, but her eyes found Katie's. "He asked for Major Rodriguez. He's been asking for her since he regained consciousness." The room went dead silent. Torres looked up from the file. His hands were trembling slightly, the kind of tremor that comes from understanding that the documents in front of him were about to become relevant in ways he wasn't prepared for. He cleared his throat and began reading from the open military record. His voice was steady, but the words themselves seemed to shake the air. "Multiple tours. Sangin Theater Commander. Silver Star recipient." He paused, looking between Katie and the Vance family. "There's a second commendation here. And a third. Distinguished Service Cross. Nominated for a decoration that doesn't appear to have been awarded, classified. There's a notation that says." He trailed off, reading silently for another moment. There's a notation that says her discharge was medical. Administrative separation. 2011. Katie's hands were still. The trembling wasn't happening. It was like watching someone else's life become evidence, watching all the pieces she'd scattered finally get assembled into a pattern that had been waiting to be revealed the entire time. Torres turned the page. Kept reading. The hearing room smelled like old leather and fluorescent heated dust. Torres turned the page. Kept reading. Her voice didn't waver as she continued into the classified section, the parts that weren't supposed to exist on a civilian personnel file. Lines about deployments. Lines about decorations. Lines about a woman who wasn't supposed to be real. The investigator's eyes moved across the document like a man reading a language he'd forgotten. 34 seconds of silence. Just the scratch of paper and the hum of the ventilation system. Then the doors opened. Not quickly. Deliberately. The kind of entrance that made the air pressure change in the room. He wore dress blues sharp as a knife edge. The uniform hung on him like it was tailored to his bones. Captain Jackson Hayes, 160th SAW Night Stalkers, medals arranged in rows that told a story of places most people shouldn't survive. He walked into that hearing room like he owned the geography, and his eyes found Katie across the table in a single, deliberate sweep. "My name is Hayes," he said. 10 words. Delivered like a mission statement. "I served under Major Rodriguez's command. Sangin Valley. 2012 through 2013. The room shifted. Ashford's shoulders drew tight. The board members exchanged looks that said they hadn't prepared for this. Hayes didn't acknowledge any of it. He turned to face the board directly, his bearing so rigid that sitting down felt like a negotiation he'd already won. Major Rodriguez received the Distinguished Service Cross for saving 43 civilians under fire. Single-handedly. While managing her own bleeding out from a femoral artery puncture. Another layer landed. Another silence. The investigator's hand moved to her file folder. Ashford opened his mouth, then closed it. This wasn't going the way he'd calculated. She was court-martialed, Hayes continued, because Colonel Vance prioritized operational security over civilian lives. He ordered those civilians left behind. Hayes leaned forward. His voice dropped an octave. She disobeyed. Dragged 43 people out of a burning compound with 12 minutes before the whole grid lit up with hostile fire. She chose her conscience. It cost her everything. The words hung there like a challenge to gravity. Ashford's face was draining color in real time, the blood pulling away from his jawline like someone had opened a valve and let it run. "That woman," Hayes said, pointing directly at Katie, "saved my life twice. Once in theater. Once after when she sat with my wife while I was learning to walk again with a titanium femur." He stood up. Slow. Deliberate. "And if anyone in this room thinks they have the authority to suspend her, you're looking at federal law now. UCMJ applies. She's a recalled asset. The Air Force general heading the inquiry, 3 stars, the kind of authority that didn't need to speak loudly, leaned back in his chair. His eyes found Ashford and locked. "Dr. Ashford," he said, voice steady as a metronome, "Major Rodriguez has been recalled for a classified medical task force. Her suspension is void, effective immediately." The room crystallized into stone. "And you," the general continued, still not raising his voice, still making every word land like a measured strike, "are being investigated for obstructing a cleared officer." Ashford's hands gripped the table edge. His mouth opened and closed 3 times without sound. Katie watched him with the same expression she might have given a monitor that was reading incorrectly. Factual. Detached. Present. She didn't allow herself to feel anything yet. Not here. Not while everyone was still watching. The hearing dissolved into crosstalk. The investigator was on a phone call immediately. Torres was reading more of the classified file to the general, who was nodding with the expression of someone who'd just realized exactly what kind of game had been played with him. The board members looked like they'd been caught in a riptide and were just now understanding the current. Katie stood and walked out. Nobody stopped her. She made it to the parking garage level before her legs remembered they belonged to her body. The concrete echoed differently down here, isolated. Private. She found her truck, a 2007 Tacoma with 287,000 miles and the kind of dents that had their own stories. She sat in the driver's seat with the door still open, her hands on the steering wheel, not gripping it. Just touching it. Like she needed confirmation that something solid still existed. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She didn't answer. It buzzed again. Again. On the fourth call, she looked at the screen. Pentagon. Official line. The kind that didn't appear on civilian caller IDs unless the Pentagon wanted it to. She answered without speaking. Major Rodriguez. Female voice. Brigadier General level authority wrapped in professional courtesy. We need you on ACR-17 to Bethesda in 4 hours. Medical Task Force briefing. Your discharge is being formally rescinded. You'll be recalled to active status at the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. The words arrived in a sequence that didn't align with the universe Katie had been building for herself. Lieutenant Colonel. Active status. Bethesda. A different life. A life that required her to stop being invisible. Yes, Katie heard herself say. One more thing, the general said. Colonel Vance woke up 2 hours ago. Specifically asked for you. He's been asking for you continuously since he regained consciousness. The line went quiet except for the hum of military-grade encryption. Thank you, Katie said. For the notification. She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand, feeling the weight of it the way you feel weight when you've been carrying something for so long you forgot it had mass. 30 minutes later, her phone was buzzing again. This time it was the local news alert. Her thumb hovered over it for a moment before she swiped open. Dr. Ashford was on screen. Live. In professional attire that he'd clearly left the hospital to put on. His hair was still damp. His face was flushed the way faces got when adrenaline was the only thing keeping them functional. I want to address what just happened at Seattle General, he was saying, his voice sharp as broken teeth. Major Katie Rodriguez falsely claimed military service. This is stolen valor. This is a woman exploiting the credibility of actual soldiers to cover up incompetence and rule-breaking in the hospital. He leaned into the camera. The military is being played. My hospital is being played. And if people don't wake up to what's happening. The broadcast cut to a different feed. Not a studio. A helicopter. Wind. The kind of camera work that happened when someone was calling in from a moving vehicle. A 3-star general appeared on screen, still in flight suit, still wearing the expression of someone who'd been extracted from somewhere important to make a point. Dr. Ashford, the general said calmly, his voice carrying over the rotor noise like he'd trained for this exact moment, I'm General Marcus Whelan, Joint Special Operations Command. What you just did constitutes violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice Articles 134 and 107. You obstructed a federal officer. You interfered with active military operations. You attempted to discredit a decorated soldier on a broadcast reaching 2.1 million viewers in the Houston metro area. Ashford's face disappeared. Then reappeared. Then the broadcast cut to split screen. The general continued. I have documentation of your calls to board members. I have emails where you specifically orchestrated this woman's suspension to protect your institutional authority. And I have a team of investigators standing in your office right now with a federal subpoena. The camera panned to Seattle General's administrator standing behind Ashford with 2 people in dark suits. Major Rodriguez's service is unquestionable, the general said. Her valor is documented. And your attempt to destroy her credibility just ended your career. You can watch the rest of this conversation happen through your attorney. The broadcast ended. Katie sat in her truck in the parking garage with the news still running and 2 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize and her entire previous life settling into the past tense like sediment in still water. For hours until the CR-17. For hours to become someone different. For hours to stop pretending that the woman she was and the woman she'd been were 2 separate people. She started the engine and drove out of the darkness into the afternoon sun. The afternoon sun hit her windshield at a sharp angle as Katie pulled out of the cemetery, her hand steady on the wheel though her chest felt hollow. She didn't look back. Behind her was James, and the rain, and the version of herself she'd tried to bury for 2 years. Ahead of her was nothing but asphalt and a question she wasn't ready to answer. The drive back to Houston stretched like pennants, mile markers ticking past as classical music played low on the radio, something about violins and surrender. She thought about her phone, still sitting silent on the passenger seat. No one was calling. No one was looking for her anymore. That changed at 6:51 p.m. The call came through the hospital's main line, routed to the ER where Katie was changing into fresh scrubs, trying to move through the motions of a shift that wasn't supposed to happen. Her suspension papers were signed. Her future was a question mark. But she'd shown up anyway because staying home meant sitting alone with James's memory, and that was a kind of dying she couldn't afford. The charge nurse appeared in the doorway, phone trembling in her hand. Katie. Now. The administrative office. They're saying the woman couldn't finish the sentence. On every monitor in the break room, the local evening news blazed across the screen in split-screen format. Dr. Ashford sat in a studio across from the anchor, his jaw tight as surgical tape, his suit jacket wrinkled despite the professional lighting. He was speaking, his voice smooth as silk and twice as slippery. The individual in question has demonstrated a clear pattern of overstepping medical boundaries and appropriating military credentials to which she has no legitimate claim. This is stolen valor. This is the kind of deception that undermines the integrity of our institution and disrespects the actual men and women who've sacrificed for this country. The camera cut to him. He smiled. He shouldn't have. I've directed legal to prepare a defamation suit against this nurse for misrepresenting her background. The hospital stands firm in our zero-tolerance policy for fraud and then the anchor's earpiece crackled. The woman's eyes widened. She held up one finger. We're getting breaking news. We're going to another guest. Sir, can you hear me? The silence on the broadcast lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then a voice came through, steady as a surgeon's hand, each syllable clipped and precise with the cadence of someone used to commanding rooms full of armed soldiers. This is General Peter Holloway, United States Army, 3-star, currently assigned to Joint Special Operations Command. I'm calling in response to Dr. Ashford's statements regarding Major Catherine Rodriguez. The break room stopped breathing. Major Rodriguez was medically discharged in good standing following a combat-related injury sustained during operations in Sangin Valley, Afghanistan, where she served as a theater commander for the 75th Ranger Regiment. She did not misrepresent her background. Her background was classified and remained so at her own request. The general's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much and cared too little about civility. Dr. Ashford suspended an officer with active federal clearance without following mandatory military liaison protocols. He deliberately withheld knowledge of her status from hospital administration. He altered personnel records. He conducted unauthorized background investigations. He restricted her access to duty assignments without cause. All of these actions constitute federal obstruction under 18 United States Code Section 1505 and military conduct violations under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Katie watched the anchor's face. She watched the news ticker crawl across the bottom of the screen. General accuses surgeon of obstruction. She watched Dr. Ashford's face on the split screen drain of color like someone had cut the cord. Additionally, the general continued, his tone never wavering, Major Rodriguez received the Distinguished Service Cross for actions under fire that resulted in the preservation of 43 civilian lives. She was court-martialed for those same actions by Colonel Marcus Vance, who prioritized operational security over human life. Major Rodriguez's medical discharge includes a classified re-evaluation currently pending appeal based on new testimony from Colonel Vance, who regained consciousness at Seattle General Hospital at 4:22 p.m. this afternoon and was fully lucid enough to identify her as the combat medic who saved his life during tonight's emergency code blue. Dr. Ashford is currently under federal investigation for obstruction and misconduct. I suggest he consider retaining counsel. The broadcast cut back to the studio. The anchor was reading talking points she clearly hadn't expected to read. Behind her, security was already moving toward Ashford's satellite location, their pace unhurried but absolute. 2 million viewers in the Houston metropolitan area watched him gather his materials with shaking hands. Watched him stand. Watched him turn toward the camera as if he might say something else, might defend himself, might do anything except what he was already doing, walking backward out of the frame like a man being erased. Katie didn't move. The other nurses were already dialing their phones, their voices sharp with gossip, with vindication, with the particular energy of a man's humiliation being broadcast live. The charge nurse squeezed her shoulder, but Katie barely felt it. She was watching the screen go dark. Watching the news ticker scroll. Watching her name appear on the screen, Major Catherine Rodriguez, DSC recipient, Army Ranger. Major. Not nurse. Not just a nurse. Not anymore. The suspension was null. The investigation against her closed. The hospital board released a statement within the hour. Seattle General does not condone the unauthorized suspension of cleared military personnel and has initiated a full review of Dr. Ashford's administrative conduct and patient care decisions. By 9:19 p.m., the hospital's CEO was on the news herself, announcing a new partnership with the VA and the establishment of a $2.1 million trauma wing dedicated to serving combat veterans. "We owe Major Rodriguez an apology," the CEO stated flatly. "We also owe this community better." 6 months passed like pages turning in a book Katie had already read. She moved through the world differently now. Still in scrubs, she'd been offered chief of trauma, had turned it down with a single sentence delivered in that voice that no longer needed permission to speak, "I do better work on the floor." Still quiet, but the silence carried weight now. The kind of silence that made residents straighten their spines. The kind that made attending physicians ask her opinion on cases instead of issuing orders. Her hands had not changed. Her knowledge had not changed. What had changed was visibility. Everyone now knew what those hands had held. Everyone now understood what that silence contained. She was in the ICU on a Thursday afternoon when she saw him through the observation window. Dr. Ashford sat at a folding table on the front steps of Seattle General, his name tag reading Steve, insurance specialist. The medical license he'd spent 30 years building was gone, suspended indefinitely pending the outcome of federal proceedings that had already decided his fate. His wife had filed for divorce. His country club had revoked his membership. The university where he'd lectured had scrubbed his name from their website. Katie didn't break stride as she passed the window. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel him watching her, the way his hand froze mid-reach toward a brochure, the way his breath caught as recognition hit him. But she was already moving forward, into the ICU, into the place where her actual life existed. She walked to the wall where the team kept their memorial, a collection of medals and photographs honoring the nurses and doctors who'd served in combat. Katie had never contributed anything before. Today, she unpinned the Ranger Scroll medal from inside her locker, the one Colonel Vance had been carrying when the ambulance brought him in. Beside it, she placed a photograph of James, his dress uniform pressed sharp enough to draw blood, his smile carrying the light of someone who'd already made peace with his own ending. She pinned them side by side, the medal on the left, James on the right, and stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on both. For the first time in 2 years, she was not two different people existing in parallel. She was not hiding. She was not performing. The woman who'd held a scalpel in combat and the woman who'd held it in an OR were the same woman. The grief was real. The job was real. The sacrifice had been real, and it mattered, and it was written now in the eyes of everyone who looked at her. A SEAL team leader named Graves, the one who'd testified at her hearing, appeared in the doorway of the break room 2 hours later with a radio in his hand. "We need you," he said simply. Not a request. Joint task force in the Horn. 14 days. Full medical team, full combat rotation. Your clearance is active and your designation is Chief Medical Officer. Katie didn't answer immediately. She looked at her hands. She looked at James's photograph. She looked at the medal catching the fluorescent light. "When do I leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow at 0600. Ramstein Air Force Base. Tell them Major Rodriguez sent you." The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Restraint against smiling too wide. Restraint against running straight out the door. Restraint against doing both at once. She took one measured breath and nodded. "I'll be there." That evening, she stood on her front porch as the rain came down again, this time warm, this time gentle, nothing like the cemetery. Her phone buzzed. Colonel Vance's name appeared on the screen. "I wanted to tell you myself," his voice came through steady and clear, "that I've requested an appeal of your court-martial conviction. The testimony I've given the Military Review Board is sealed, but I want you to know that I was wrong. Not about orders. About you." Katie didn't respond immediately. She listened to the rain. She listened to the silence between them. "Thank you, sir," she finally said. That means something. When she hung up, she didn't feel like a victim being vindicated. She felt like someone whole for the first time in a long time. Someone who could hold grief and purpose in the same breath. True class is what you do when the lights go out. If you found yourself in Katie's position, knowing your value but forced to hide it, would you have done the same thing? Would you have walked back into that room after being suspended? Subscribe to see more stories of the quiet warriors walking among us, fighting battles no one sees, changing the world without needing applause. The next video drops in 3 days. Don't miss it.